Welcome to the second part of my discussion with Mai Nardone about this collection of stories, Welcome Me to the Kingdom. In this part, you'll hear us talking about the relationship between English and Thai, as well as legacies of colonialism. If you're enjoying our conversation, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Can we move on to, let's say, some of the intercultural aspects of the novel and the politics of language that go with that? So obviously the book is written in English, and several of the stories address the status of English, both as a kind of dominant lingua franca, but also as a marker of social status. But it also contains quite a large number of Thai words and phrases. So I was curious about this. I mean, firstly, on a personal level, did you feel in any way, is it a sort of sense of conflict in terms of writing English, or is that a kind of productive tension? And also more generally, how do you think writers can effectively recognize and use less dominant languages in their writing?
Yeah, I was talking to a Filipino friend about this recently. This is Glenn Diaz, who wrote The Quiet Ones. And he talked about wanting to write one of his later books in either Tagalog or another Filipino language, in order to, especially a country with like such a recent colonial history as the Philippines, with Spain and then America, and as a way of sort of resisting that colonial heritage. Whereas for me, this book could only have been written in English. Like I had to learn to read Thai outside of school because I just wasn't taught how to read Thai at school even. And so like, it's interesting to me, for example, to read literature in Thai. I remember the first time I read Prabda Yuan's, one of his short story collections in Thai. And I realized, and this is what's sort of different as someone writing sort of half in, half out in English for generally a foreign audience, is that like, if you read Prabda's work, a lot of the Thainess comes out through the playfulness in the language. Like the language is super playful in a way that I couldn't even imagine pulling off. And it's excellent, but actually it deals very little with cultural aspects of Thailand. And I think this might be why he exports so well. Like I hear he's really popular in Japan. And I think that's because he talks about general sort of urban ennui, and he has these sort of postmodern antics in his work, and a lot of those translate because they do feel universal, because the culture bit has been somewhat stripped away. And so I think like if you look at this book, or if you look at a book like Sightseeing, which is a story collection that came out in 2005, you see a lot more attention paid to these cultural aspects that are going to be more interesting for the foreign viewer. And so in some ways, like it is already a failed project in that it's always going to be foreign gaze, because the audience is outsiders, English speakers. I was asked recently if this was going to be translated into Thai, and I sort of laughed because, one, there's no market for grim literary short stories in Thai, and two, a lot of it is the sorts of things that you would see every day. And so I don't know if the observations, if the stories really like carry their power and their weight. And so I don't know about escaping that legacy. I'm always going to be an English language writer. And I feel like there are more English language writers writing about Thailand coming out. Yeah. And then there's an entire other like market forces side to this that I won't get into, but, the reality is also that like the centers of publishing are, in the dominant languages, in this case, English.
Right. My next question might push you in that direction a little bit, because I mean, you did just mention colonialism in the context of the Philippines. And, the term colonialism comes up a few times in the collection, not a lot, but when it does, it's pointed, particularly in the mouths of certain characters. Can you explain what you or your characters mean by colonialism in the context of contemporary Thailand?
Yeah, I think it's usually sort of an accusation that's being lobbed at somebody when it comes up in this book. I often think of, so the colonial relationship, so something else that I did in college, which is like a typical American thing, is that you study in a foreign country in whatever language that you're taking. And for whatever reason, I was in Argentina studying economics in Spanish, and I realized that it wasn't just a language difference, that they were actually teaching different economic models. And what was really popular there still in 2009 or whatever it was this, what they call periphery theory or core periphery theory, which is the idea that there's a core, which is a more developed something, and then there's a periphery, which is less developed, and the relationship between the two is extractive towards the core. So it's always the core taking away from the periphery. And you can see from a former colony, and especially Argentina has this like real kind of European heritage, and they had their golden age around 1900, and you can still see a lot of that legacy in the architecture downtown, which is today literally crumbling. And they're always sort of looking backwards, and this is way pre, Make America Great Again, and this sort of nostalgia for old nationhood. But they were always kind of looking at that, and they were looking at the 70s and the 80s and these extractive relationships that they were in, and these economies, and the sort of the most obvious model of a core periphery relationship is colonialism with the center of empire and the colonies. And I think that kind of still holds, even though Thailand has a sort of slippery relationship with colonialism just because it wasn't formally colonized. But even, and I remember looking this up when I was writing the story collection, in 2000, there's something called like the primate city, which is where a city is like X number of times bigger than the next biggest city. And it usually represents some sort of imbalance in the country. And at the time, Bangkok was 40 times the size of the next nearest largest city. I think today it's something like 8 or 9. And that city is, the second city is now Chiang Mai. But it still points to this relationship between like a hyper-developed core, a center of opportunity, and these provincial outskirts, which have much fewer opportunities, and therefore people need to commute into the center. And that creates all sorts of imbalances for democracy, as we've seen. And I think that when characters are sort of using this accusation in this book, they're also, it's also sort of working within that context, because as the prologue says, the first couple in this book are people who are coming from the countryside to the city exactly for those types of opportunities.
Thank you. And I think last question before we turn it over to the audience. So, center-periphery relationship, I think, plays out in a lot of the transcultural relationships we see in the collection. And it seemed to me reading it that many of the characters were kind of trapped by their group identity, whatever form that might have taken, whether ethnic, sort of class-based or transcultural, which we might not even think of as an identity. Yet it seemed that, in some cases, transcultural identity, which maybe suggests, trans is kind of crossing over, it sort of suggests movement and opportunity, but actually those characters also seem to be trapped by that identity and unable to move beyond it. So in general, my feeling was that the book was quite pessimistic about the sort of possibilities of moving out of one's social group. Would you agree with that, or are there opportunities in there that maybe I'm not picking up on?
Yeah, I've never thought of it in sort of cultural terms, which I sort of like as and I think that the transcultural aspect does probably have a lot more movement. The socioeconomic side probably less so. And it's even, I think of sort of even within the Thai side of my family, my mother, who's Thai Chinese, went to university here, got a degree in biology, couldn't get a good job, and what was, whenever this was, I guess the 70s, what was an opportunity out of the country for her at the time was to become an air stewardess with Cathay Pacific. And fast forward a generation to my generation, my cousin also has a business degree from a good university, can't get a good salary. What does he do? He becomes a pilot for Thai Airways. And he hates flying. He doesn't like being away from his family. He doesn't actually like being in the air, but
if you hate flying, that's a pretty rough job.
the opportunities are such that, and if you want anything close to kind of like a foreign salary, you sort of have to get out. And it's the same way that if you have money in this country, you're often sent to a boarding school, to an international school, to university abroad, grad school abroad. And so like the venues for economic sort of escape are still outside. And it's something that, to come back to the English thing, there are two stories in here that appear back to back. One of them is called English. The other is the story City of Brass that we've talked about. And English is about a boy who is from a poor background, and he sort of misunderstands the relationship between English and privilege, and that he thinks if he has English, and actually I was in a Grab taxi on the way here, and this is exactly what the taxi driver told me, because he was complaining about this. He was like, I'm not going to repeat what he said, but he said, English doesn't get me anywhere. Like, I learned English and it has done nothing to improve my life. He used to be in sales. Now he's a taxi driver. The boy in this story also kind of misunderstands that connection where he sees English as the language of privilege. And so he learns it thinking that that'll move him up, when actually English is a marker of privilege often. And that those who are privileged will learn English, and it's not always the other way around. I mean, there's tourism and some of these sectors where, yes, English is advantageous, but and then to come back to the cultural part, the kind of the title story, Welcome Me to the Kingdom, is one of the characters who's looking like half American, half Thai, and her kind of trap and her mistake is almost to believe that she needs to belong to like a single cultural identity, which is something that, like the third culture kid will kind of understand this need to like buy into a monolithic identity, and always to be looking for that, and therefore always to be excluded from that, because the monolithic identity defines itself by its exclusiveness, right? Like, you cannot be Thai because you are half American, because you are whatever. And these are how we draw our national identity boundaries. And so I feel like for that character, her trap is actually not understanding that there is potential for this transculturalness, and for her to sort of like overcome that cultural boundary.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers. So I think we'll conclude the interview part there and move on to audience questions.